Hello friends! My voice is a little bit off today as I've been sick lately, but I think it's improved enough that I can start making videos again. I do apologize for the sound. Today I want to talk to you guys about ADHD. It's something that I have been diagnosed by myself in my childhood, something that I took medication for, and something that I overcame myself, which means that now I no longer require medication to be able to focus and perform effectively. So I want to tell you guys a little bit about ADHD in general, about what's prescribed for it, about my experience, and about my views on it. So let's get started. First of all, I want to tell you guys that I do not believe that ADHD is a normal disease. It is actually a phenotype, maybe even a genotype. A phenotype means it's a way something behaves or a way something looks. Basically, it means that people don't have sufficient attention to accomplish their daily tasks. So basically that means, like in a child, that would be a child is reading a paragraph, and every time they reach to the end of the paragraph, they realize they don't recall anything from that paragraph. Even though they were trying their best, they're sitting in a room with a book rereading certain paragraphs. This used to happen to me a lot when I was a child, even when I was 8 years old or 9 years old. I had a great deal of trouble basically maintaining my attention on a subject that I wasn't naturally interested in. So that's basically the phenotype. And as it regards me saying that it is polygenic, what that means is that it's not one gene that causes ADHD. In fact, if you are one of my customers that have bought the cognitive enhancement package from my website, you'll see that in the various neurotransmitter systems, each of them have polymorphisms that are associated with ADHD. So you can find this in the glutamate neurotransmitter system, in the GABA system, and all kinds of systems. What that means is that different changes in different systems can cause this end resulting phenotype where people have less than average attention or memory. So I wanted to establish that first. I don't believe it's a disease. I wanted to mention that. Second of all, I want to talk about the traditional treatments. So traditionally, actually, historically, one of the treatments was tranquilizers. As you guys may have heard from my interview of Arthur Benjamin, the mathematician and professor of mathematics at some university in California. Anyway, he in his youth had ADHD and they prescribed him Valium. So some of these kids were hyperactive because of their lack of attention. So there is often a phenotype that is one is hyperactive and one is not. So apparently he was hyperactive and they used to give them tranquilizers. But recently there's been a development which is called cognitive behavioral therapy. Basically, cognitive behavioral therapy seeks to change someone's behavior by practice, by exercises. The third method, which is the most common method across the world, is stimulants. There are several stimulants that are used to treat people with ADHD and ADHD. The reason being that these stimulants either increase, well, they do both actually, but it's probably either their increase of dopaminergic activity being the driving force and motivation on our brains. When you have more dopamine, you have more drive. Or the adrenergic activity, that's adrenaline, which gives us that energy to do something. So for example, if you were a person with ADHD that's not hyperactive, you might benefit from having more adrenergic signaling because it gives you that sort of energy to get going. It's also involved in that fight or flight response system, so it can have side effects in the long term. But if you're someone with a hyperactivity disorder, you may benefit less from that adrenergic signaling. Anyway, let's talk about the drugs. So the first drug I should mention is amphetamines. So amphetamines are the first drugs that were used for ADHD. There are kinds of amphetamines. There, for example, MDMA is an amphetamine, ecstasy, MDA is an amphetamine. But the normal amphetamine has two isomer types. One is called dextroamphetamine and one is called levoamphetamine. Levoamphetamine produces, and by the way, this is true for all kinds of molecules. Like all kinds of molecules have two isomers, and many molecules, the different isomers act differently in the body. The isomers are basically symmetric opposites of the molecule. So the dextroamphetamine produces more of a dopaminergic effect. The levoamphetamine, the levo rotation of amphetamine produces more of an adrenergic effect. So some people choose to take, instead of amphetamine, dextroamphetamine, like me, because I don't like that adrenergic effect. Some people want more of that amp and that adrenergic effect, so they take levoamphetamine. Some people, or some pharmaceutical companies, make mixtures of these two isomers into brand name products like Adderall. Adderall is essentially 75% dextroamphetamine and 25% levoamphetamine. My voice is getting a little tired, but sorry for that, guys. So two other drugs that are commonly used, methylphenidate, which is also called Ritalin in the US, and Concerta in Europe. Methylphenidate produces less of a dopaminergic effect than amphetamine and less dopamine transmission than amphetamine. Therefore, it's thought to be potentially less addictive. There's also a drug called Strattera that is used. I have never used Strattera myself, and I have not even reviewed the academic papers on the subject because it is such an inferior drug that I'm not interested in it. So that's a review of the drugs that are used. Now let's talk about some considerations about these drugs. Number one, extended release versus short release. When I was young and I was given these medications, I was given an extended release by a doctor, by a psychiatrist who probably didn't know what he was doing. Some people take extended releases because they think that having stable neurotransmitter activity in the brain is good. But these doctors seem to be very uneducated. They don't understand that our brains have diurnal and nocturnal patterns. They have circadian rhythms that rotate around the day. If you have excess dopaminergic signaling at night, you will not be able to sleep well. In fact, specifically, you will not be able to get into deep sleep, which will cause significant health problems in the long term. More significant than that, if you have a long release thing that inhibits the reuptake of dopamine, like amphetamines or methylphenidate, or inhibits the reuptake of adrenaline, which is even worse, you may end up in the long term, over like 10 years, developing a form of anxiety or a form of PTSD. Because having upregulated adrenaline all the time is what a human being would feel if they were in war. That's what people felt in World War I, which is why they had PTSD after it, which they used to call shell shock or something like, I forgot what the word was. So you don't want that excess signaling all day. You always want a short release version of whatever you're taking. That's my first tip. My second tip is that you need breaks. I didn't know this when I first used these drugs prescribed by a doctor. In fact, my psychiatrist specifically told me, do not take days off on the weekends. And I remember telling my psychiatrist, excuse me, I need to take a drink. I remember telling my psychiatrist, I don't have to study on the weekends as much. Why would I need to take the Adderall? I don't need to focus. And he told me, no, you need stable blood levels for some reason. So I believed him. This is not true. Well, it may be true, but it is not effective in the long term. Why? If you have this inhibition of dopamine reuptake and dopamine transmission from a drug like amphetamines every single day, your body wants to reach homeostasis. Recognizing that signal, it will downregulate dopamine receptors and you will get less of an effect from the drug in the long term. But you'll be taking more of the drug on the long term. So you'll have more toxicity and you'll have more effects on your sleep and you'll be less sensitive to the drug. This is called tachyphylaxis, the desensitization to a drug. So what I've learned through trial and error personally in my lifetime is that 4 to 5 days a week maximum is what one should use these stimulants for. And one should specifically have those 2 days a week where they'll be a little bit down and stuff like that because they're recovering. Their receptors will a little bit upregulate. And overall, this will keep a person, even though 2 days a week they're not taking the Adderall, it'll keep a person far more effective overall, even just with the 5 days a week. So the next thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is this subject of, okay, what is ADHD? Let's talk about it a little bit because I want to impart some knowledge that I've learned over the years. So ADHD can often be anxiety, not an issue with focus. It can be an issue with anxiety. For example, kids that grow up in traumatic childhoods will often show symptoms of ADHD. because they can't focus in school on their test, because every time they go home, their dad beats them. Or something like that, they slowly, and it's not even just the fact that their dad beats them when they get home, but the fact that their dad beats them when they get home turns up their adrenergic signaling in their brain. So they're always on guard. So while they're taking that test, they're so on guard that they can't focus on a question. So ADHD could come from a hyperactive HPA system or hyperactive adrenergic signaling in the brain. It could also come from, for example, excess glutamatergic signaling. Glutamate is the main excitatory neurotransmitter in the nervous system, but too much glutamatergic signaling becomes sort of noise in our brains. It causes oxidative stress, and oxidative stress causes the release of pro-inflammatory cytokines from the nervous system, meaning that we end up having a foggy brain, basically. We have a brain fog, difficulty concentrating, and so on. So sometimes inhibiting some of that glutamatergic activity could actually improve someone's concentration. The same thing can happen from the GABA system. There are polymorphisms in the GABA system that are associated with ADHD. How could that be? Well, GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter. It makes you relaxed. If you're on edge all the time, you're also going to have a problem focusing as well, right? I'm just going through neurotransmitter systems to give you guys some ideas. It's even true for the histamine system. Histamine is excitatory in our brains. It's also a neurotransmitter, and it affects things like brain fog and things like that. So some people, for example, get allergic reactions to food dyes or things like that, and they develop symptoms of ADHD from polymorphisms in their histamine genes. This is actually true. This has been found in East Asian children. It could be in your cholinergic system. So for example, the cholinergic system is most important for memory. You could have actual dysfunction in your cholinergic system. Maybe improving your cholinergic system would improve your concentration as well. I talked about norepinephrine, noradrenaline, and I talked about glutamate. It could even be your serotonin system. So serotonin, the feeling of serotonin, of high serotonergic signaling, is a feeling where you're at peace. It's sort of like when you were a baby with your mother. It's that comfort. If you don't have enough comfort, again, you could have difficulty concentrating. So what I'm trying to show you guys is there are so many reasons that someone could end up with a problem concentrating, and addressing dopamine and adrenaline with stimulants only addresses one or two or even potentially three of those potential problems. So to get the best results, you may have to combine other things to deal with those other neurotransmitter systems, or you may want to study your genes so that you can actually know where are the SNPs most associated with ADHD for me. Because some people, for example, often with like Latin Americans, a lot of it is in the glutamatergic system. With some other people, it could be in the dopaminergic system. So it depends on yourself. And the next thing I wanted to mention to you guys is some other potential tools that you can use for the cholinergic system. So I only mentioned this system. There are other systems that you could work on, but the cholinergic system is sort of a low-hanging fruit. So most of the people that are trying to improve their concentration, they go after this class of drugs called racetams, which are found often on the Reddit subreddit nootropics, r/nootropics. A lot of people ask me to make videos about racetams. I may make them one day. I want to tell you guys my opinion of racetams briefly in this video. A true nootropic does not create stimulatory effects. So that's why racetams were originally attractive. They were seen to work through the cholinergic system and to produce modest results in studies. Well, if they work through the cholinergic system and they are not stimulatory, they will not be more effective than the drug donepezil, which is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and a sigma-1 agonist. Its sigma-1 agonism will also enhance the effects of amphetamines. So the racetams will never exceed this. Now, some racetams are actually stimulants, and they produce tachyphylaxis, a lowering, like a quick reduction to the effects of the drug. Well, those drugs will never be better than amphetamines. So for me personally, and I've tried a lot of racetams, they are just drugs for people who are not very serious about cognitive enhancement, right? Or maybe they're scared of the more serious drugs and they want to try these experimental drugs that are actually less well understood, when we actually do understand the side effects of the better known drugs like donepezil and amphetamines, and we probably can protect ourselves from those side effects. So that's what I want to say about racetams. Now, in terms of drugs, donepezil is the leading one for the cholinergic system. Now, in terms of supplements, I supplement a lot for the cholinergic system, and I'll tell you what I do personally. I take 3 supplements every morning. I take berberine, which is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. By the way, for you guys that don't understand what acetylcholinesterase is or the cholinergic system, go to my playlist section on my page and you'll find one called the cholinergic series. Watch that series. It's a little boring, but it's very informative. You'll learn a lot. And by the way, guys, in general, for my channel, going through the playlist is the best way to learn anything. Anyway, I use donepezil as a pharmaceutical drug, but when I use supplements, which I use daily, I use berberine, which is an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor and an activator of AMP kinase, and a PCSK9 inhibitor. It's a great drug, a great herb. I also use ginkgo biloba, which is the most powerful acetylcholinesterase inhibitor among the herbal extracts. And I use also huperzine A, which also inhibits some NMDA glutamatergic activity, reducing some of that excitatory activity, which could actually be producing some of that ADHD effect. I also use alpha GPC sparingly, sometimes with them. Alpha GPC releases choline in the body, quickly allowing it to enter the brain, join up with acetyl-CoA, the acetyl group from acetyl-CoA, and become acetylcholine. So that's in terms of the cholinergic system, what I do for supplements, and you can do that as well yourself and you'll see results from that. In terms of training, I want to mention something to you guys. If you have ADHD and you're a young man and you take your psychiatrist's advice and you take between 5, I didn't mention doses, by the way. I should mention something. Dopamine and glutamate are neurotoxins. Amphetamines upregulate the activity of these neurotransmitters that are neurotoxins. Neurons, they like to be tickled. They don't like to be attacked by neurotransmitters. When they are attacked, they downregulate their receptors. If they don't downregulate this enough, they die. That's why you don't want to overdose on amphetamines, and you don't want to develop any tolerance, which is why you have those days off every week. So between 5 and 10 milligrams of amphetamines is the maximum dose one should use on those days. Maximum. You should do other things that may be able to enhance the effects of that dose, but do not increase the dose. There are people taking 30 milligrams a day. Those people are causing the death of neurons, I'm quite sure. There are people taking 60 milligrams a day. Those people are killing neurons. There are addicts on the street taking the exact same drug, amphetamine, putting it in a pipe, in a gram dose and smoking it, and they're killing their brains. So be very careful with the dose you take. I take 5 milligrams. Sometimes I take 7.5, just to show you, if I ever take it. When I was very much younger though, by the way, I want to mention, my psychiatrist prescribed 15 milligrams to me. And I was too young to know about the differences and to make a judgment. I trusted the psychiatrist and I took it every day of the week. There can be side effects to this. You can have dopamine downregulation. You can develop anhedonia over a period of months because you've constantly been having this high dopaminergic signaling. And you may have fresh dopamine receptors. You don't need to do that. Always start with the lowest dose possible. Always the lowest dose, and don't exceed 10. Now, what I want to tell you about training is this. When you take your dose, I need another drink of water. Excuse me, guys, I'm sorry. When you take your dose, you should consider yourself in a superhuman state. Once you take that dose of amphetamine in the morning or whatever stimulant you're taking, even if it's methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, which I highly recommend against, unless you have a genotype where you have low adrenergic signaling and fine dopaminergic signaling, and those people are excessively rare. But anyway, if you're taking a drug that increases dopamine like amphetamines, consider yourself a sponge for the next 6 hours or so. If you take that drug while you're watching TV, you probably will get stuck watching TV. You'll watch the whole season. You'll remember everything from that season. You'll become the best TV watcher on earth if you do that for a year straight. because this amphetamine actually increases plasticity in the brain. And it habituates you to what you're doing because of dopamine. Dopamine habituates you to whatever you're doing. So the trick is this. You only use the amphetamine when you're doing something that you find difficult to do, but something that you want to train yourself to habituate yourself to do, like studying, for example. So for example, you wake up in the morning. This is what you do. You first start studying. You don't take the pill before you start and you go take a shower and stuff. No, no, no. Take your shower, get started, get ready, start studying, even if you can't concentrate, and then take the pill, and then continue studying until 5 to 6 hours has passed. Do not get off and go grab your phone. For example, what I used to do in undergrad is I used to actually lock my phone in a closet in my house while I was studying, just to remove all distractions. Because when your dopamine and adrenaline are signaling highly, you will be even though you're more focused, you'll be able to get into focusing on other things. You don't want that to happen. Why I'm saying this, again, habituate yourself to something you want to do, because this is a hack for life. This can make you something you could never be before. The second thing is, your brain is plastic when you're on the amphetamine. You will adapt to what you're doing. You want your brain to become good at solving problems, at solving case studies for your strategy consulting interviews, at doing programming if you're a computer programmer. You don't want your brain to adapt to watching TV, right? So keep that in mind. This can never go without a training program. There's no free, you don't just take Adderall and go on a road trip or something like that. That's ridiculous, right? Another thing I wanted to mention is the permanence of the change. This is true. Okay, I've experienced this myself, but it's across the academic literature. Young people who have ADHD who are put on amphetamines, in the long term, their brain actually changes such that they are better able to focus than they were previously, and they no longer require the medications to focus. This has indeed happened to myself, even though I only used the drugs for 4 years or so continuously. I had a permanent change in my ability to think for the better. Like a really great improvement. Unfortunately, afterward, I experienced some TBIs and stuff like that, and I no longer have the level of cognitive performance I once had, but it improved tremendously from the use of these drugs, and the improvement remained for years afterwards. So that's one thing to think of. And the last thing I want to talk about is long-term use. The concerns with long-term use of stimulants is the effects on the cardiovascular system, specifically increased heart rate and increased HPA activation, the stress signaling activation. You have to build a supplement program and lifestyle program around this. For example, I absolutely never take an amphetamine without a beta blocker that passes through the blood-brain barrier. So I actually take an amphetamine that increases adrenergic signaling, and then I block some of that adrenergic signaling, and my heart rate stays the same. And there are people who took amphetamines for very long extended periods, had long lives and successful lives. For example, the mathematician Paul Erdős, who was a great mathematician, was taking amphetamines his entire life, never diagnosed with ADHD. He did it for cognitive enhancement purposes. I hope this video was helpful for you guys. Let me know if you have any comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.